because I know that there is hope for the homosexuals, that if they're willing to turn from sin the same as any individual, that they can be ex-homosexuals the same as there can be an ex-murderer, an ex-thief, or ex-anybody.
As Europe left the Dark Ages and entered the Enlightenment, approaches and worldviews shifted dramatically. Reason became more important than religion in much of the West, and this affected the way that Europeans interacted with things. One of the things this period had the greatest effect on was homosexuality. Prior to this time, homosexuality had been punishable by castration and execution, and it was primarily a religious lens through which the issue was seen. But as religion lost some of its footing in intellectual communities, people began to examine homosexuality through a somewhat scientific lens. And whether these newly enlightened men theorized that gay people were their own separate sex, as Carl Jung did, or that they were gay because they had some traits of the opposite sex, as Havelock Ellis did, these theories were flawed and reflected the disconnect between the experiences of queer people and the worldview of the men who tried to theorize about them. As time went on, this trend continued, and rather than asking lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people about their experiences, these biased and disconnected theorists attempted to define, and in some cases cure, a phenomenon for which they had no personal knowledge. And whether they used religion, flawed science, or some miserable combination of both, these people who defined a community without understanding it caused irreparable harm to the members of the community, in obvious and not so obvious ways.
One of the most harmful misunderstandings about homosexuality was the conflation between homosexuality and mental illness. Although this misconception had proponents throughout the 20th century, it was officially put into the DSM in 1952. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, is a book containing descriptions, symptoms, and other criteria for diagnosing mental disorders, and which is published by the American Psychiatric Association. Each edition is an important symbol of the scientific understanding at the time of publication. Homosexuality's presence in the DSM is a tragedy which resulted in the suffering of thousands, and its removal was a triumph, even though many of the tragic ideas persist to this day.
Around the turn of the 20th century, the study of homosexuality changed hands from sexologists like Ellis to psychoanalysts like Freud, and this shift changes the nature of the theories themselves. Unlike many older theories which attributed homosexuality to some innate quality, Freud's ideas pointed to external factors as the cause of homosexual behavior. As his theory spread, many latched onto this idea and used it as they began to attempt to reverse it. These ideas gained traction during the Cold War, where fear of total atomic annihilation combined with repressive expectations for robotic conformity created an environment where any behavior outside of normality was deemed defective. To many people, it seemed only logical that something as deviant as homosexuality was a mental illness, as homosexuality, like mental illness, deviated from what was acceptable. Thus, it is unsurprising that homosexuality was added to the DSM during this era.
The APA's definition of homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disorder sparked several scientists to study homosexuality in the name of finding a cure. Many doctors claimed to be able to cure homosexuality with a moderate success rate. Later, these studies would be debunked, but at the time, they were largely thought to be credible. This irresponsible science was paralyzing for the LGBTQ+ community. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other aversion conditionings were common treatments, but in reality, they did more harm than good. Sam Brinton, a gay man who was subjected to this type of conversion therapy, describes it in detail.
And it culminated in electroshock therapy. So electrodes were attached to my fingers, and then shocks were given to me while I was shown pornographic images of men having sex with men. My first kiss, within seconds, I would puke just simply from the excruciating pain of remembering what that felt like.
These trials and tribulations united the queer community. Mutual fear of medical torture, persecution, and alienation brought them together in large cities where they could share their personal struggles with others like them. As a result of new queer communities, groups like the Mattagine Society formed to advocate for the acceptance of LGBTQ+ people. However, even these communities fell prey to the oppressive conformity of the 50s and were heavily scrutinized. They were forced to endorse the idea that homosexuality was an illness and needed treatment. Furthermore, support from the scientific community was ignored. One of the most important studies in support of LGBTQ+ people, titled The Adjustment of the Male Overt Homosexual, discovered that there were no real mental differences between gay and straight people. But Dr. Evelyn Hooker's findings, and findings like hers, wouldn't truly be appreciated for some time. This was a difficult time for LGBTQ+ people, but change was coming. The civil rights movement showed queer people that they too might be able to end years of pain and marginalization. These new ideas only needed a spark to explode into a movement, and on June 28, 1969, that spark happened. At the Stonewall Inn, after years of antagonization and belittlement, queer people rioted against the oppressive police force and began the gay rights movement. A major battle in this new movement for gay rights was showing the American Psychiatric Association that homosexuality wasn't a mental illness and would be a huge triumph for the gay people in the United States.
Even before Stonewall, Frank Kameny and Barbara Giddings had been a part of the fight for gay rights. Having both experienced discrimination as a result of their sexuality, they worked together in New York City and pioneered the gay rights movement. Their work in the gay rights movement led them to the annual APA meeting in San Francisco in the 1970s. In collaboration with the Gay Activists Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front, Kameny and Giddings energetically disrupted the convention. Their forcefulness called for security, but they were awarded a panel dedicated to the issue the following year. Giddings and Kameny both spoke at the panel, and for the first time at the APA, queer people's voices were being heard. Still, after the convention in 1971, homosexuality remained in the DSM. The convention in 1972 needed to be more convincing, so the panel consisted of more than just queer people telling their stories. That year, 2 doctors were invited to speak at the convention in hopes of offering a more scientific viewpoint to the members of the APA. Alongside heterosexual Dr. Judd Marmer was another psychiatrist who remained anonymous for the entirety of the panel. The fear of losing his medical license kept him masked. Although the request for removal was denied in 1972, the testimonials heard during the 2 years leading up to 1973 were instrumental to the 1973 decision. Partly as a result of the protest, the Nomenclature Committee of the APA redefined a mental disorder as something that caused regular distress and impaired a patient's functionality. Homosexuality didn't meet those standards, and thus it could not be included in the next edition of the DSM. And this was just the beginning. Within the next few decades, the APA would be joined by the American Psychological Association, American Public Health Association, and the World Health Association in depathologizing homosexuality, freeing gay people from being labeled as mentally ill.
In a national telephone poll earlier this year, NBC News found that 57% believed that homosexuality was a mental illness, even though the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Public Health Association say it is not a mental illness.
The discredited practice of conversion therapy will negatively affect an estimated 77,000 current LGBTQ+ youth before they turn 18, and has already affected an estimated 698,000 U.S. adults. However, LGBTQ+ people continue to speak out against this mistreatment, and as a result, 15 states have laws against conversion therapies for minors and for patients without informed consent. Just 30 years after the decision at the APA, sodomy was officially decriminalized, and 12 years later, gay people would finally win the right to marry. These events were triumphs, not only because they increased equality, but because they represent gay people raising their voices and finally being listened to. Throughout recent history, queer people have been tragically mistaken for mentally ill and have suffered at the hands of ill-informed doctors. When queer people raised their voices in the face of this tragic adversity at the APA in the 1970s, they proved that their sexuality was just as valid as their straight counterparts, and showed that they could triumph over prejudice.